In the previous episode, we looked at the potential of the F-16 fighter jets destined for Ukraine, as well as the most dangerous Russian anti-aircraft missile systems and fighters. In light of this, let's see what, how, and what extent the delivered F-16 fighters are suitable for various missions and what is required for them. The safest use of Vipers is high-altitude patrolling in Ukrainian airspace, far from the front line, is to hunt down incoming terrain-following cruise missiles and long-range drones. In this case, 3 drop tanks can be carried because the electronic jamming point in the centralized station is simply unnecessary. At a distance of 150 km from the base, at a speed of Mach 0.6, at 10 km of altitude, an F-16 can loiter for about 2 hours and 30 minutes with 6 MRAM missiles and 3 drop tanks. Following this, the F-16 still has enough fuel to perform a fuel afterburner acceleration to Mach 0.9, then fly 150 km using maximum military power to perform an interception if it is necessary. The maximum return distance with a small reserve fuel is possible from 300 km. If the Link 16 data link is available and NATO or US AVAX is nearby, the efficiency of the interception is higher. With data link support, the Viper can receive track data from these planes or the appropriate Western radar system, therefore the Viper does not rely on its own mechanical scanning radar. Communication via data link is far faster and more efficient than via radio speech. What could be the targets of these BARCAP sorties? Based on the experiences of the war, there is no need to intercept Russian manned aircraft which perform these strike missions. The Russians simply do not fly such sorties due to threats of the area denial capable SAMs like the remaining S-300PT, PS, the Patriot and NASAM systems. Drones down to roughly TB2 Bayraktar and Garand 2 drone size certainly can be downed, but against smaller targets the proximity fuse may not work reliably. The KH-555 cruise missile is also a suitable target. Shooting the helicopters and drones near the front line is a different story, they are discussed in the extra content. There are many ways a fighter jet can perform a combat air patrol, each with advantages and disadvantages. It is essential that patrolling is carried out by at least a 2-ship flight on a single cap station. This is the only way to ensure continuous monitoring of the designated airspace. One member is always flying towards the zone where the targets are expected. To make the analysis simpler, we consider such a cap station where the 2 planes of the flight fly on the same track on the usual racetrack pattern. When one of the plane the flight turns away from the front, the other just turns towards it. To create a barrier zone along an 800 km long front line, many cap stations are needed, each with a 2-ship flight airborne. During the Cold War, the typical distance between MiG-31s would be 200 km from each other. We use this distance as a basis for the assessment. The MiG-31BM's radar can detect an incoming 5 square meter radar cross-section target in ground clutter from about 280 km. The detection range is only half, 140 km against a receding target. Thanks to the 10 km flight altitude, the radar horizon does not restrict the detection range. If F-16 fighter jets were to attack the patrols head-on, we quickly realized that it would be a hopeless attempt. Considering the 280 km detection range of the radar and reaction time, a MiG-31BM can launch an R-37M missile farther than 200 km. Even if we assume less than normal, only 200 km launch distance, the Mach 4 average speed missile would hit the Mach 0.9 speed F-16 when it is still about 160 km away from the MiG. The AN/APG-66 radar has only a small antenna, the radar has only 110 km range. An F-16 easily can be downed by an R-37M missile long before it can even detect the MiG-31 or the Su-31 fighters with its radar. Even if an F-16 somehow managed to get much closer, it would be still a one-sided engagement. The AN-100C5's engagement zone, launched from a terrain-following fighter, would be about 30 km against a target which flies at 10 km of altitude. while the R-37M in terminal phase guides itself thanks to its own radar. The MiG-31 can break the lock and can turn away or back when the missile tracks the F-16 its own, while an F-16 has not launched any MRAM. A two-ship MiG-31 flight carries 8 missiles. They can attack 8 targets at the same time with these. Performing a head-on engagement of such a firepower is simply suicidal. Of course, we can say that the Russian missiles will hit the tow decoys and the electronic jamming pods will do the magic, but in my opinion, this is just a blind fate. Treating their effectiveness as a black magic is not a wise thing. It is also difficult to judge whether the radar warning receiver of the F-16 is able to provide adequate information when it is best to deploy the tow decoys, if the delivered F-16 fighters will have such a device at all. It will be difficult attacking even just a two-ship Russian cap flight from two different directions. Assuming 4:1 ratio, when two 4-ship F-16 flights are attempting the attack, still each plane can be targeted with one R-37M missile if the Russian fighters split up. In addition, to share the firepower, it is required that no other Russian fighters be present, which could be intervene the operation. Moreover, if the risk is too high for the Russian fighters, they can turn back and retreat at any time. The F-16s would not be able to pursue them either because of their range or the threat of the long-range Russian SAMs. Following the climb and acceleration, what would be needed for a pursuit, the SAMs could engage the F-16s. In short, a direct confrontation with the Russian BARCAP seems impossible if they are performed with a certain distance from each other and they are equipped with the S-37M missile. How can we determine the weapon loadout of a Russian BARCAP? More about this question a bit later. The risk of strike missions is basically determined by how far the Russian fighters perform in the cap from the front. The trajectory of the cap, the distance from the front, and the parameters of the attacking F-16 determine the time until the detection and missile launch from a Russian cap. If the F-16 or any other aircraft can turn back in time, the radar of the Russian fighter may lose the target before the missile reaches the terminal phase. Why? Because instead of the maximum 280 km, against receding targets the detection range is halved, it is only 140 km. If the target tracking is broken while the R-37M missile is still guided by the MiG and it is relatively far from the terminal phase, the F-16 can change its heading and fly enough long to a different direction, what makes impossible to the missile to find its own radar, which has also a reduced range against receding target, only about 13 km against a 5 square meter radar cross-section target. This is quite short. After the MiG lost track, neither the speed nor the direction of the target is known, a new interception point simply cannot be calculated. The missile flies simply blindly to an invalid interception point. Compared to the original interception point, the changed but unknown point can be even 50 or 80 km from each other. There can be a 100-degree difference in azimuth angle between the points if the loss of the track happens about 35-40 seconds before the terminal phase. As larger the distance between the target and the S-37M missile, when the MiG lost the target tracking, increases the chance of survival. A strike mission is considered relatively low risk if the strike ordnance has already been released and the F-16s have turned back, but the R-37M is still relatively far from the terminal phase. This relatively far is about 35-40 seconds in terms of missile flight time. To make an assessment regarding the feasibility of the strike, it is necessary to know the distance from which a certain type of weapon can be launched. The F-16 uses terrain following profile to get as close to the front line as possible while avoiding the detection of long-range ground-based radars. The range of every unpowered air-to-ground weapon depends on the release altitude and the speed because of gravity and drag. The drag decreases with increasing altitude. The question is the optimal release altitude and the speed, which provides enough long range for glide bombs and missiles but also ensures the escape, turning back in time before the S-37M missile gets too close. How does the climb and escape maneuver looks? After a quick climb on full afterburner power, at a certain altitude the bombs are released. Following the release, the pilot performs a 180-degree roll, then with a vertical turn, dives the plane into a 70-degree pitch dive. This ensures breaking the radar track of the MiG because it makes the F-16 a receding target. The plane descends at sea level just under Mach 1 speed under the radar horizon. The time required for the whole maneuver is shown in the table. The time is 0 when the F-16 pilot pulls the stick to initiate the climb. The third column shows the time to climb a certain altitude with a speed what never goes below Mach 0.75. The fourth row shows the moment when, following the turn to dive, the F-16 becomes a receding target. The fifth row shows the time when the plane is under the radar horizon compared to a ground-based radar. The fourth row is important against the MiG-31 or Su-35, the fifth column is when a SAM is the threat. The range of a glide bomb or even an AGM-88 missile depends on the altitude and speed at which they are released from a plane. The GBO-39 SDB has about 10:1 glide ratio based on the catalog data if it is released at a speed of Mach 0.75 in level flight at an altitude of 10 km. This is how we get the 100 km nominal range, which can be exceeded in case of a more extreme launch conditions. The GSOV has a 100 km range with similar release boundary conditions. Based on the figures, it is worth performing the quick climb up to an altitude approximately 9 or maybe 10 km with the GSOV. With each gain 1 km of altitude, the range of the SDB and GSOV increases approximately 10 and 13 km. Increased weapon range means that the distance between the front line and the weapon release point can be larger. As the distance of the release point increases from the front line, the flight time of the S-37M missile to the F-16 also increases, which is essential for survival. It takes 33 seconds to cover 10 km with Mach 0.9 speed, which is 300 meters per second. What does this mean? If it takes more time than this to increase the altitude by 1 km and then descend, it is not worth it. Because of the decreasing engine thrust as the altitude increases, the climb rate decreases with increasing altitude. The pitch angle of the climb at certain altitude must be decreased with increasing altitude. These factors combined lead to the conclusion that climbing above 30 or 33,000 feet is the optimal choice. The pilot initiates the pole up at a speed of 0 Mach 0.9, the engine is already on full afterburner. The climbing angle is set to 45 degrees, which can be held only up to 3 km of altitude. Above that, the F-16 would quickly lose speed, therefore the angle of the climb is set slowly lower to have the 0.75 Mach bomb release speed at the final altitude of the climb. The bombs are released 71 seconds after starting the climb. Releasing 8 SDB bombs is possible within 2 seconds. Following the release, a roll is performed, followed by a dive with a vertical turn. 16 seconds later, the F-16 is now an accelerating, descending and more importantly a receding target compared to the BARCAP. At this point, if the distance is large enough between the MiG and the F-16, the Russian plane lost the radar track of the Viper. The horizontal distance of the climbing maneuver is 15 km. The distance from the target when the climb is initiated is 15 km plus the range of the certain weapon. Interestingly, the range of the AGM-88 HARM missile is roughly the same what the GSOV or the SDB have. The difference is in their average speed. The HARM has about 400-600 meters per second speed, depending on launch altitude and speed, thanks to the initial acceleration of the rocket engine. The range of a HARM launched at 10 km of altitude about 100 km or a bit higher. The kinematic or utilized range of other types of weapons, laser bombs, GDAM or the Maverick missile is under 20 km, even if they released or launched at medium or high altitude. In some cases their guidance, in other cases the kinematic range determines the maximum range. Their range makes them quite unsuitable in case of Russian BARCAP, as we will see it. One of the most important factors is the distance between the two BARCAP flights because it limits the maximum flyby distance, which has a strong impact on the success and limitation of any airstrike. If two Russian fighters are 200 km apart, an F-16 cannot have a larger flyby distance than 100 km. This is half the distance between the flights. Let's examine in the first step this case. If we consider perfect timing, the F-16 will be 160 km away from the front when the Russian BARCAP detects it. If we expect only a 6 km penetration depth for the bomb, then the release distance is 96 km. 15 km distance is required for the lofting maneuver, the climb and the bomb release. The climb must start from 105 km from the front. The remaining 55 km from the detection to the ascent point would take 183 seconds. The execution of the jump to 10 km of altitude would take an additional 47 seconds until the F-16 becomes a receding target after following the dive. In total, these take 270 seconds. The Russian fighter jet reacts within 20 seconds of the initial detection, at which point the F-37M missile is launched. The distance of the F-16 from the Russian fighter is about 220 km when the bombs are released. The missile, with an average speed of 1.1 km per second, covers this distance in approximately 200 seconds. The strike cannot be carried out safely. From the moment of the first detection, the missile would reach the F-16's weapon release point in about 220 seconds. The incoming missile would have been using its own radar, while the F-16 is still in the quick climb phase. However, with this model, it is possible to achieve a scenario with an acceptable risk using the GBU-39 glide bombs. The F-16 with a flyby distance of 160 km is capable of this. According to the model with perfect timing, the first detection distance is 130 km from the front, so the F-16 is only 25 km away from the starting of the quick climbing. The flight time from the first detection until climb is 100 seconds less, only 83 seconds. Within an additional 87 seconds, the F-16 becomes a receding target. In total, from the first detection until being a receding target, 170 seconds is passing. At this moment, the R-37M missile is about 50 seconds to reach the bomb release point of the F-16. The distance between the Russian fighter and the F-16 is larger than 140 km. The MiG loses the track of the F-16. Following the rapid descent, the F-16 can change its heading, which provides a high chance to avoid the R-37M missile, as was explained earlier. The missile and the Russian fighter at this point has no idea about the heading and position of the F-16. Using the same model, similar calculations can be performed for the AGM-154 GSOV weapon, which has a launch range of 130 km from high altitude. This means, compared to the SDB, the release point can be about 30-35 km farther from the front line with the same penetration depth. With this taken into consideration, we can get the result as a 85 km of flyby distance. It is almost half compared to the SDB. Just one small addition to judge the feasibility of these strikes. The flight time of the R-37M missile is always a lower estimate, since an F-16 always be farther than the bomb release point. The missile needs to fly farther, which takes more time. Conclusion: based on the calculations, a pair of MiG-31 aircraft could potentially defend a ± 160 km wide zone against an SDB-equipped F-16 and about a ± 85 km wide zone if the F-16 uses the larger GSOV glide bomb. If the flyby distance is larger, perfect timing is not needed. If the Russian BARCAP flies farther from the front line, for example because of the threat of the unknown S-200 Dubna base SAM, it opens the door for deeper strike or the defended zone becomes far smaller. In the modeled cases, only targets very close to the front line can be attacked because the penetration depth was only 6 km. Essentially, area denial SAMs cannot be attacked with hard missiles because they are likely too far from the front line. At best, the medium and short-range radar-guided systems of the Army Air Defense can be attacked, which are closer to the front line, but even those systems would likely have sufficient time to react. If the Russian Air Force can maintain continuous surveillance over the front with 5 cap stations, even without AWACS support, it would block the F-16 operations close to the front line, whether we are speaking about drone or helicopter hunting, or in a strike mission with glide bombs. In the case of SDB, 3 cap stations likely be more than sufficient. In the case of GSOV, 5 is needed. However, just as the Ukrainian Air Force may not know what type of missile is on a patrolling Russian fighter, the Russian Air Defense would similarly be unaware of the loadout of the radar contact. If the number of cap stations is underestimated, it could potentially render the defense ineffective in a given situation. The goal is to use the reconnaissance data provided by Western countries to deploy the F-16 in areas where Russian fighter patrols cannot reach in time or are absent altogether. Therefore, we are talking about highly time and area-sensitive operations where the difference between success or spectacular failure depends only minutes. As for how many cap stations Russian Air Force can sustain for extended periods, that's a good question, and more details will be covered in the additional content. There could be around 100 MiG-31BM and an equal number of Su-35s available, but not all of them are stationed near Ukraine. This is also shall be considered. Also, the availability of the L-37M missiles is not known to me or to the public. It cannot be determined what armament a patrolling fighter jet has. If there is a Russian fighter patrol, the safest option to consider is an S-37M platform. However, there is one more small addition. The F-16 also has the option to retreat. The strike can be aborted if the distance between the F-16 and the Russian fighter is 140 km or more. At this point, the retreating F-16 cannot be detected by any Russian fighter radar. The strike mission may fail, but to achieve this, continuous cap is needed from the Russians. Pursuing the receding F-16 in Ukrainian airspace can be risky for the Russian fighters as well as because of the SAMs. In fact, flying at high altitude seems dangerous even on the Russian-controlled airspace 160 or even 300 km away from the front. The 2 shotdown cases of the A-15 AWACS planes happened at such large distances. If cap stations were 160 km from the front, it would essentially become ineffective if the F-16s have glide bombs. From Russian perspective, cap stations need to be relatively close to the front. The nearest point of the oval track should be 50 km and the farthest point cannot be more than 100 km away. Flying further than that, the width of the protected zone would be dramatically reduced despite the large Zaslon radar and the amazing range of the S-37M missile. It can be seen that the Russian defense does not have too much room for maneuver in some parameters of the equation. If Russian fighter patrols cannot be avoided, from the currently integrated weapons, only the AGM-158 GSSM would be suitable. Another option is the AGM-84 Harpoon against naval targets, but only with the Block 1C or later version, which can be launched from 220 km. The relevance of the latter is low thanks to the drone ships, which sunk many larger vessels so far. If the European Storm Shadow or the Taurus cruise missiles were to be integrated into the F-16's inventory, similar to what has been done with the Su-24 in the past, it would be possible to conduct long-range strike missions with these weapons as well. This is not an unrealistic idea, even for the Su-24 was doable the minimum level of integration. While the F-16 has the most widely used and flexible databus system. The F-16 can also support the use of cruise missiles with the ADM-160 MLDL decoys, creating additional targets for the Russian air defense system, whether they are fighter, jets or anti-aircraft missile systems. In fact, employing such equipment has already happened, but maybe from the Su-24 or any other jet. If there is no Russian BARCAP nearby, only the ground-based air defense remains as a threat. However, the possibilities here are much more permissive compared to dealing with the patrolling fighter jet. The assessment here is limited to the S-400 with the 48 N6DM missile and the S-300 V4 systems. For them, the radar horizon is a limiting factor. The target cannot be detected until it climbs above the radar horizon. A target can break the missile guidance if descends under the radar horizon, even if the launch happened at higher altitude. The reaction time of the S-400 and the flight time of the missile determine the safe distance of the weapon release, considering a given flyby distance. Despite the Mach 6 burnout speed, the missile's average speed is approximately 1.1 km per second compared to the distance from the missile launch point. To the 100 km distance, the missile flight time is about 90 seconds. The missile flight time must be added to the time from the initial detection to missile launch, which is considered here as 20 seconds. As was presented previously, the climb to 10 km of altitude, then descending below the radar horizon, takes 115 seconds. As far as can be known, long-range air defense systems are generally positioned roughly 70 km from the front line to make it more difficult for hostile long-range artillery to attack them. The estimated bomb release distance from the S-400 battery is 120 km. The missile flight time is about 110 seconds. The F-16 initiates the climb under the radar horizon, but until it gets above the radar horizon and the target acquisition radar detects and provides a track, it demands about 10 seconds. Then the total time for the target assessment, the identification, missile preparation and launch needs about 20 seconds. The total time of the engagement is 10 plus 110 plus 20, which is 140 seconds. So, even with such a small distance behind the front line, an S-400 battery cannot prevent the F-16 from releasing SDB bombs and avoid interception no matter the zero flyby distance. The only option left is to shoot down the launched weapons. With GSOV bombs, targets behind the front lines can be attacked with a range of 30 km even with zero flyby distance. With a flyby distance of 50 km with the SDB, the penetration depth reaches 20 km, and with the GSOV it is 50 km. If the S-400 missile battery is even further from the front line to be protected against artillery, it expands further the possibilities of the Ukrainians. This means the S-400 has less time to shoot down the launch glide bombs. Moreover, these bombs would reach their targets earlier if the F-16s get closer to the front line. How useful is this strike potential? It doesn't seem practical attacking the S-400 missile battery itself, especially if it is more than 30-40 km behind the front line. Since the S-400 system has 12 target channels and in some cases they are protected by 2 or 4 Panzer vehicles, at least 3 dozen of SDB and GSOV is needed to penetrate this firepower with a saturation attack. It seems more logical to attack targets from as large distance as possible from SAMs. This increases the number of bombs which can reach their targets. For F-16 fighter jet, essentially glide bombs, AGM-88 HARM and long-range cruise missiles are the only feasible options for strike missions in case the presence of BARCAP or area denial SAMs. Ideally, these actions should be executed with a flyby distance ranging from 80 to 160 km. This primarily seems realistic for the western part of the Crimean Peninsula and perhaps the southeastern part of the front around Kherson. Additionally, hunting and shooting down drones entering at least 100 km from the front is doable, but only if the MRAM can hit them. The range of MRAM can also be extended launching from a quick jump. Naval strikes also seem okay with Harpoon missiles if there is a need for it, but considering the success of drone ships, this seems unnecessary. However, considering all of these factors above, it is hard to imagine that Ukrainians would deploy a dozen or more aircraft in an all-or-nothing manner, even if they had the necessary weaponry. This would require such a target and target area that justifies the risk, while it is not protected by fighter patrols and there are only shorter range SAM systems nearby. Simultaneously meeting so many conditions make the probability of such a situation very low. For those surprised at how limited the F-16 can be used, even with an advanced weapons, if BARCAP or long-range SAMs are present, here are some historical contrasts. How and when was the F-16 used in previous conflicts? It was typically used by a side with a quantitative and qualitative superiority as part of a larger packages that included F-15 fighter jets, dedicated wide visual strike aircraft suppressing air defenses, electronic jammers, and all these were mostly supported by AWACS. Despite this, both Iraqi and Serbian air defense could shoot down several F-16s and other 4th generation fighter jets. In Ukraine, there is no Ukrainian quantitative superiority, nor a wide spectrum of specialized support aircraft. The West can only assist with a time-sensitive reconnaissance data. The United States had good reason to initiate the Joint Strike Fighter program in the 90s, which led to the F-35 fighter family. Even then, it was clear that the capabilities of non-stealth fighter jets would reach their limits when they will have to deal with such threats which are widely available for the Russians in the current war. The NATO F-16 operators are replacing them with the F-35A fighter jet. Not only Viper operators acquired this aircraft, but also countries like Italy, Finland, Germany and Switzerland. Since mid-November of 2022, the Ukrainian war can be considered as a partially frozen conflict. Looking at the big picture, the front lines have not shifted significantly. Even if the transfer of 2 or 3 dozen F-16 fighter jet occurs, with every weapon what they need, the current base of the situation won't be vastly different. So, the F-16s may cause greater losses in some areas, especially if the A-15 AWACS planes or even BARCAP can be pushed farther with the unknown S-200 Dubna-based Frankensam. The threat of more gliding bombs can be new threats what the Russian Air Force and Air Defense might deal with, but there is no indication and it is hard to imagine that 1 or 2 dozens of F-16 will turn the table and shift the conflict from a deadlock. If you like the video, you can share, like, subscribe or ring the bell and follow the channel. You can support it via Patreon for exchange for early access, voting on planned topics and extra content and updates about the project. So far, 10 Patreon extra content has been released, their description are in the link under the video.